I was cut out of the will by my mom and stepdad because I'm not family. But now that I've inherited $3 million, they want me back. So let's start from the beginning. When I was 14, my life took a sharp turn. My mom decided it was time to settle down again. This time it was with a man who already had a son from his previous marriage. He was 17, 3 years older than me. We didn't exactly hit it off from the start. We hit it off right away. By the time the marriage certificate was signed, there was already some tension. At first, it was just the usual small arguments you get when you put two strangers together in a house and tell them they're family. He'd leave dirty dishes in the sink like they'd clean themselves, and I'd get the blame for the mess in the kitchen. Or I'd find my shampoo missing. My new stepbrother was using my favorite hair product, and it was disappearing faster than usual. My stepdad and mom were both making things difficult for me. My stepdad would assume that I was the root of all problems, and my mom was so caught up in trying to make this new family work that she didn't notice the little things. My mom and stepdad had been trying to make this new family setup work for a year. Then, they had news. They were expecting a baby. The house needed redecorating, and my room was chosen for the nursery. I got shuffled to the smaller guest room, which barely had space for my stuff. Felt like a demotion. As my new half-brother grew up, it became clear that he was the golden child. My stepbrother, who was already spoiled, seemed to take cues from him and became more entitled. He dropped out of college and came back home, bringing trouble with him from late-night parties to dodgy friends coming and going at all hours. Complaints met with a shrug from the stepdad and sorrow. My mom looked at me like she wanted to say, "What can we do?" I started spending more time at friends' houses, anywhere I could feel a bit normal. School became my escape. I joined clubs, stayed late for extra classes, anything to avoid going home before I absolutely had to. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was survival. The atmosphere at home was suffocating. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the next blow-up. One particular evening stands out in my memory. I came home later than usual after school. The house was unusually quiet, which struck me as odd. I found a note on the fridge saying they'd gone out for dinner. A family dinner, I assumed. I wasn't told about it, and it hit me hard. It was as if they'd forgotten I existed unless I was there to be blamed for something. The breaking point came not long after my 18th birthday. I'd saved up some money from a part-time job, a job I got despite what my stepdad said. He complained about how it would affect my studies, which was just another way of saying he didn't like not having me around to blame. I came home one day to find my room turned upside down. My stepbrother had thrown a party while the parents were out, and somehow my room became the casualty. Beer stains on my project papers, a broken lamp, and my privacy completely violated. I confronted them all at breakfast the next day. My stepdad's response was cold and dismissive. He said I was frustrated. I felt like I was being treated like a child, and I wasn't being given the freedom to make my own choices. I wanted to be more responsible with my belongings, but it felt like I was constantly being watched and judged. My stepbrother, who had become a bit of a couch potato, was always off the hook, while my little half-brother was just a kid, but he was treated like he was the favorite. The amount of coddling he got made it clear who the favorites were. I remember working on a big science project that I was really excited about. I needed quiet and space, both of which were in short supply at home. I tried to set up a little workspace in the corner of the living room, but it was like I had set up in the middle of Times Square. My stepbrother would blast his music, my little brother would be running around screaming, and there was my stepdad always finding some reason to. He'd tell me to move my stuff, saying I was taking up too much space, or that my project was making a mess. It was frustrating. I felt like I was trying to build something delicate in the middle of a tornado. One day, I'd had enough. I packed up my project and went to a friend's house. Her parents were always welcoming, and they let me spread out my work in their quiet dining room. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I suddenly realized how abnormal my home life had become. My friend noticed my relief at just being able to work in peace. "You're always welcome here," she said one day, seeing the stress melt off me the minute I stepped into her house. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to me. It also made me realize that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. Home should be your safe place, not somewhere you escape from. I started picking up more shifts. At my part-time job, if I wasn't at school or at a friend's place, I was working not just for the money, but because each hour away from home was a little easier to breathe. My stepdad didn't like it, always ranting about how a job was distracting me from schoolwork. But I knew the real reason he didn't like it. I wasn't around as much for him to find fault with. That's when I started planning to move out. As I thought more about it, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. My mom and stepdad wouldn't take it well, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the only way I could get some control over my life. Then came the day I finally told them I'd found a small apartment not too far from college, and it was affordable on my budget. I sat them down and told them I was moving out. The room fell silent. It was so quiet you could cut the tension with a knife. My stepdad was the first to react. He said, "You think you're ready to live on your own at your age?" My mom just sat there looking between us, her face unreadable. I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I need my own space." The argument that followed was brutal. Accusations were thrown about. I was called ungrateful and worse. I was trying to get away from my responsibilities at home. My stepdad even tried to guilt me about leaving my little brother behind. He said, "You know, he looks up to you." That was his rationale for me to stay in a situation that was making me miserable. I stood my ground. This wasn't just about wanting my own space. It was about needing it for my mental and emotional health. I packed my things over the next few days. Each item I put into a box, feeling like a tiny piece of the whole. The day I moved out, my mom came to my room. I was expecting another argument, but instead she helped me pack. We didn't talk much, but when we did, it was superficial. "Do you need more boxes? I can give you some of the old kitchen stuff." It was like if we stayed on safe topics, we could avoid the massive elephant in the room. When I finally closed the door to my new apartment after moving everything in, I felt a wave. I was flooded with a range of emotions, including relief, sadness, excitement, and fear. I was now truly on my own. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. Those first few nights were the hardest. The apartment felt too quiet and too empty. I missed even the annoying noises of my family home, or at least I did at first. But as days turned into weeks, I started to appreciate the peace. I could come and go as I pleased, eat when I wanted, and sleep without being disturbed. It was like discovering a new part of myself that I had kept hidden. I'd been away from home for a while, and I settled into a routine pretty quickly. It was the most peace I'd had in years. My relationship with my mom and stepdad wasn't great, but it was manageable since I wasn't under their roof 24/7. I was doing my own thing, staying busy with work in college, and keeping my head down. Then, out of nowhere, my stepdad had a health scare. That shook everything up. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough for him to start thinking about the future, specifically his will. I heard about it through my mom, who called one evening sounding a bit more somber than usual. But it was serious enough for him to start thinking about the future, specifically his will. I heard about it through my mom, who called one evening sounding a bit more serious than usual. "Your stepdad's been thinking about his will," she said. I replied, unsure where this was going. The tone in her voice hinted that it wasn't just a courtesy call to keep me in the loop. He paused, then continued. "He's decided to include your stepbrother and your half-brother, but not you. He feels it makes more sense since they're his biological kids." I was taken aback. Not that I was expecting anything, but hearing it laid out so bluntly was a bit of a shock. It wasn't the money or the potential inheritance that hurt. It was the clear message that I was an outsider in the family. I'd spent over 5 years trying to fit in. I kept my voice neutral, and thankfully, my mom picked up on my hurt feelings. She quickly added that it was just legal stuff and that it didn't change how we felt about me. I wasn't really convinced, and the conversation awkwardly shifted to other topics before ending. But that night, I felt that familiar ache of not belonging. The weeks that followed were tough. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation and how I felt. Part of me wanted to. I thought about confronting my stepdad and asking him for an explanation or at least letting him know how much he'd hurt me. But another part of me wondered why I even cared. I hadn't felt like a part of their family for years, so why was this any different? I decided to pull back and limit my visits even more. It was a way of protecting myself from being hurt further by people who had already shown that they didn't consider me family when it really counted. Then the actual wake-up call came. It wasn't a dramatic event. No yelling matches or tearful showdowns. It was quieter than that, more profound. I was at a coffee shop working on a term paper when I overheard a group at the next table. They were laughing and sharing stories about their families. It was the usual ups and downs, normal stuff. It hit me that I didn't have that. I hadn't had it for a long time, if ever. That realization sparked something in me. I started to question why I was allowing myself to be upset over it. I was excluded from a will when I had already been excluded from the family in every way that mattered. It wasn't about the money. I wanted to feel valued and loved by the people who were supposed to be my family. From then on, I made a conscious decision to focus on the relationships in my life that did make me feel valued. Friends who had become like family, professors who mentored me, colleagues who respected me. I invested more in those connections. Gradually, the hurt from my stepdad's will and the feeling of exclusion from my family began to fade. Will and the feeling of exclusion from my family began to fade. It wasn't an overnight change. There were still moments of bitterness, especially during family gatherings when I'd see my stepbrother and half-brother getting all the attention. But I was learning to accept that some things were out of my control. I was building my own sense of family and belonging. The real test came when my stepdad's health scare passed and life returned to normal for them. I was invited to a family dinner to celebrate my stepdad's recovery. I went more out of a sense of obligation than anything else. The dinner was as awkward as I expected. My stepdad talked about his recovery, my half-brother talked about his latest school achievements, and my stepbrother bragged about a new job. I sat there quiet, and it was clear I was the odd one out. This time it didn't hurt as much though. I finally reached a point of peace with my role in this family. I was the outsider, and that was okay because outside that house, I had people who cared about me for me, not for what I could bring to a will or a family name. After dinner, I left early, making some excuse about an early morning. As I drove home, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was okay, really okay for the first time in years. I had faced the reality of my situation, dealt with the emotional fallout, and come out the other side stronger and more self-assured. I've learned that life has a funny way of throwing you surprises when you least expect it. After getting comfortable in my own routine and accepting the limited relationship with my family, I got a call one afternoon that turned everything on its head. It was from a lawyer I'd never heard of before. He introduced himself in a formal, almost apologetic tone and asked if I had a few minutes to discuss the estate of my grand-aunt. We had a quick chat about my grand-aunt's estate. I have to admit, I barely remembered her. She was one of those relatives you hear about in stories from your parents but don't really know. She had no children of her own, and I remembered her being mentioned as someone who helped raise my dad. The lawyer told me that she had passed away recently. He was a bit of a mix between professional and sympathetic. She left her entire estate to you. I was pretty blown away. I felt a mix of emotions. Sadness for her passing, confusion about why she chose me, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility about what was coming next. The lawyer explained that my granda had been quite well off, having invested wisely over her lifetime. She left behind a sizable estate, including a trust fund that was now mine, totaling around $3 million. My financial situation changed overnight. After the call, I sat there with the phone in hand, trying to process the news. Why me? We didn't have a close relationship. I didn't know her that well, but I visited her a few times. Those visits were more about checking in on an elderly relative than bonding. Maybe she saw something in me. Maybe it was her way of reaching back to family one last time. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with the lawyer, signing documents, and learning exactly what I had inherited. It wasn't just money. There were properties, stocks, and a few personal items that had sentimental value. Among them was she had written a letter explaining her decision. She admired my independence and determination. She said I reminded her of herself at my age. With this new wealth, I made some immediate changes. I bought a house. I'd never thought I'd be able to afford it so soon. It was modest, but it was mine. It represented a new chapter in my life. I also invested in a rental property. I was thinking ahead about long-term financial security. I put the rest of the money into savings and investments. I spoke with a financial advisor to make sure I was making smart choices. But with great wealth comes great responsibility. I soon found out, and it was quite the drama, that I hadn't told anyone in my family about the inheritance. I wanted to avoid any potential fallout. Secrets have a way of coming out, though, and this one was no different. It started with my cousin, who somehow got wind of the inheritance through mutual connections in the legal world. Before I knew it, my mom knew, and once she knew, everyone else did too. It wasn't long before everyone else found out too. Phone calls started coming in, not just from her but from my stepdad, my stepbrother, and even relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone seemed to have a reason why they needed a piece of my inheritance. They said times are tough or that my stepdad's health had been bad. It was as if they all suddenly remembered I existed, but only as a bank. I was bombarded with requests for loans, gifts, and outright it felt like I was under constant pressure from people demanding money. I was overwhelmed and wondered if I was being selfish by holding on to the inheritance. But then I remembered all the years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, of scrimping and saving, of working hard for every dime and getting myself through college without their help. This was my chance to secure my future, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. I wasn't going to let guilt or manipulation sway me when my mom asked directly why I hadn't thought to share the news with her. I had enough. I explained calmly but firmly that the distance between us wasn't just physical but emotional. Her decisions, and by mentioning those of my stepdad and stepbrother, I'd shown where I stood with them. The inheritance was a chance for me to do things on my terms without relying on anyone else. It's my life, I told her, and I need to live. I'm sorry if that hurts you, but I have to do what's best for me now. As I expected, the conversation led to accusations of being ungrateful and selfish. I stood my ground, though, and eventually, the calls became less frequent and the requests for money dried up. It was a tough lesson in who my real family was. It wasn't defined by blood or marriage, but by the people who I valued, the relationships I had with people who supported me without expecting anything in return. I continued to nurture these relationships. The inheritance was a bittersweet reminder of my grandmother. I wish I had known her better. Her final gift was not just the wealth she left me, but also the clarity and conviction to stand up for myself, no matter the cost. The inheritance was supposed to be a blessing. It was a windfall from a distant relative who thought I might do something good with it. However, as soon as word got out that I was suddenly a few million richer, it felt more like I'd painted a target on my back than received a gift. After I made it clear to my mom and the rest of the family that I wasn't going to hand out cash just because we shared some DNA, things got chilly fast. The phone calls and texts that were initially filled with thinly veiled hints for money turned into outright pleas, and then into angry demands when I held firm on my decision to keep my finances private. I had to keep my finances private. It wasn't just the immediate family either. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly very interested in reconnecting. I received messages like, "Hey, I just heard about Aunt so-and-so. I'm sorry to hear she passed, but could you help me with some money? Times are tough." It was like they all had the same script, only the names were changed. One of the toughest calls was from my stepdad. He'd never been warm, but now he was cold and calculating. "We've always thought of you as part of the family, so it's only fair that you think of your brothers during this difficult time.